When Michael Jordan's mother collapsed in tears on national television, nobody knew the heartbreaking secret she was about to reveal. And what her son did next changed everything. The cameras were rolling on national television when Dolores Jordan's composure finally shattered like glass hitting concrete, and millions of viewers watched as the woman who had raised the greatest basketball player in history pressed her trembling hands against her face and wept with such raw vulnerability that it seemed to reach through the screen and grip the heart of everyone watching. The host of the morning talk show froze, unsure whether to cut to commercial or reach across the small table that separated them. While in a hotel room 3,000 miles away, Michael Jordan sat on the edge of his bed watching his mother break down and felt something shift inside his chest that he had not experienced since he was a small boy, afraid of the dark. What had brought Dolores to this moment of public tears was not immediately clear to the audience, and the camera operators instinctively zoomed in closer as if proximity to her pain might reveal its source. But Michael knew even before she spoke another word, because he had carried the same weight in his own heart for longer than he cared to admit. The story that led to this moment began not in the glittering arenas where Michael had performed miracles with a basketball, or in the boardrooms where he had built an empire, but in a modest house in Wilmington, North Carolina, where a young mother named Dolores had once made a promise to her 5 children that she would give them everything she had, even if she had nothing at all. She was barely 24 years old when she spoke those words, standing in a kitchen where the linoleum was cracked and the refrigerator hummed loud enough to wake the neighbors. But her voice carried the kind of certainty that made her children believe that poverty was just a temporary condition and not a permanent sentence. Her husband James worked long hours at an electric plant, coming home with exhaustion written in every line of his face, while Dolores took on job after job, working as a bank teller during the day, and sometimes cleaning offices at night when the bills piled higher than her paycheck could reach. Young Michael, who was called Mike back then, and who had not yet grown into the body that would make him famous, would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to find his mother at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of envelopes, her lips moving silently as she performed the impossible mathematics of making too little money, cover too many expenses. What Michael remembered most from those early years was not the absence of things they could not afford, but the presence of his mother's determination that they would never feel poor in spirit even if their pockets were empty. Dolores had a way of transforming deprivation into adventure, telling her children that generic cereal tasted better than the name brand because they could use their imagination to decide what it was supposed to be, or that walking to school instead of taking the bus gave them time to notice things that rushing past in a vehicle would cause them to miss. She read to them every night from library books that she checked out by the dozen, her voice bringing to life worlds far removed from their cramped house, and she insisted that each of her children learn to articulate their dreams with clarity and conviction because speaking something aloud was the first step toward making it real. Michael's dream was simple in those days, uncomplicated by fame or fortune, just a desire to be good at basketball, to feel the satisfaction of a ball swishing through a net, to earn the respect of the older boys who dominated the playground court near their house and made him wait hours for a chance to play. Dolores saw in her son's obsession with basketball something more than just a child's passing interest, recognizing in his single-minded focus a reflection of her own stubborn refusal to accept limitations, and she began to save money in a coffee can hidden in the back of the pantry, coins, and crumpled dollar bills accumulating slowly until she had enough to buy him a real basketball instead of the half-deflated one he had been using. The day she presented it to him, Michael had looked at his mother with an expression that she would later describe as the purest joy she had ever witnessed. And he had wrapped his arms around her waist and promised her that he would make her proud someday, a promise that seemed impossibly large coming from a skinny kid who had not yet made his middle school team. She had knelt down to his eye level, placing her hands on his shoulders, and told him that he already made her proud just by being himself. But if he wanted to chase this dream, then he needed to understand that talent alone would never be enough, that he would have to work harder than everyone else, practice longer than anyone thought reasonable, and never allow setbacks to convince him that he was not capable of achieving whatever he set his mind to accomplish. The years that followed tested the truth of Dolores's words in ways that would have broken someone with less resolve, because young Michael faced rejection after rejection, doors closing in his face with such regularity that it seemed the universe was trying to tell him to find another dream. He was cut from his high school varsity basketball team as a sophomore, a humiliation so profound that he went home and locked himself in his room and refused to speak to anyone for hours, While downstairs, Dolores stood outside his door with her hand pressed against the wood, listening to her son's muffled crying and feeling her own heartbreak and sympathy. She wanted to burst into the room and tell him that the coach was wrong, that the world was unfair, that he deserved better. But instead, she waited until his tears subsided and then knocked gently, asking if she could come in. When Michael finally opened the door, his eyes were red and swollen, his face a mask of teenage despair, and Dolores sat beside him on the bed and said something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, words that would echo in his mind during every difficult moment that followed. She told him that being cut from the team was not a judgment of his worth but an opportunity to prove that he was made of sterner stuff than the boys who had made the roster, that he could either accept this setback as the end of his story or use it as fuel to burn brighter than anyone expected. Michael chose to burn, and the intensity of his commitment to improving his game became almost frightening in its totality, as if he had channeled all his hurt and anger into the singular purpose of proving that the coach who cut him had made the biggest mistake of his life. He would wake before dawn to practice shots in the driveway, the rhythmic bounce of the ball on concrete serving as his alarm clock to the rest of the family, and Dolores would sometimes watch from the kitchen window as her son performed the same moves over and over again with mechanical precision, never satisfied, always reaching for some standard of perfection that existed only in his own mind. She worried sometimes that he was pushing himself too hard, that his obsession with basketball was consuming too much of his youth. But James reminded her that their son had inherited her own relentless drive, and that trying to slow him down would be like trying to stop a river from flowing toward the ocean. So Dolores supported Michael's dream in every way she could, attending every game once he finally made the team, sitting in the bleachers with a fierce pride that made other parents uncomfortable because her belief in her son was so absolute that it seemed to border on delusion. Except that Michael kept proving her right by becoming better and better until college scouts began to take notice. The scholarship offer from the University of North Carolina felt like vindication for all the early morning practices and late-night disappointments, and when Michael came home waving the letter that would change the trajectory of his life, Dolores had cried tears of joy that she did not try to hide, pulling her son into an embrace that said everything words could not express. She had known from the moment he was born that Michael was destined for something extraordinary, not because he was her son and mothers are supposed to think such things, but because she had seen in him even as a baby a quality that set him apart, an intensity of focus, a refusal to be satisfied with anything less than his best effort. College basketball at North Carolina allowed Michael to develop his skills under legendary coach Dean Smith, and Dolores made the drive to Chapel Hill for every home game she could attend, often bringing other family members with her because she wanted them to witness what she had always known, that her son was special. James would tease her about being Michael's biggest fan, but there was no mockery in his voice, only admiration for the way his wife had nurtured their son's dream when it would have been easier to encourage him towards something more practical, more guaranteed. The night Michael hit the game-winning shot in the national championship game as a freshman, Dolores had leaped from her seat with such force that she nearly tumbled over the row in front of her, and strangers had grabbed her arms to steady her while she screamed his name with a mother's unfiltered elation. She did not care that she was making a spectacle of herself or that cameras were capturing her unbridled celebration, because in that moment all she could think about was the little boy who had once cried in his room after being cut from his high school team, and how far he had traveled from that place of pain to this pinnacle of achievement. After the game, when Michael found his mother in the chaos of celebration, he had lifted her off the ground in a hug that said, "Thank you for everything, for believing when no one else did, for the sacrifices she had made, for the coffee can full of spare change that had bought his first real basketball." And Dolores had whispered in his ear that this was just the beginning, that he was capable of so much more. Words that proved prophetic as Michael's college career blossomed into stardom, and NBA scouts began projecting him as a potential #1 draft pick. The decision to leave college early and enter the NBA draft was one of the hardest choices Michael had ever faced. Not because he doubted his ability to compete at the professional level, but because leaving school meant disappointing his mother, who had always emphasized the importance of education. Dolores had made all her children promise that they would finish their degrees no matter what other opportunities presented themselves, and she had been serious about that promise, viewing education as the foundation upon which any successful life must be built. When Michael came to her to discuss his decision, She had listened without interrupting as he explained that the opportunity to be drafted third overall by the Chicago Bulls was too significant to pass up, that he could always return to finish his degree later, that the financial security the NBA contract would provide could transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone in the family. Dolores had been quiet for a long time after he finished speaking, her face unreadable, and Michael had felt his stomach twist with anxiety because his mother's approval meant more to him than the opinion of any coach or scout or general manager. Finally, she had reached across the table and taken his hand and told him that she trusted him to make the right decision for himself, but that he had to promise her that he would eventually complete his education because a mind was the one thing that could never be taken away by injury or age or changing circumstances. Michael had promised, and though it would take him years to fulfill that promise, he eventually did return to the University of North Carolina to complete his degree, walking across the stage to receive his diploma with his mother, in the audience crying tears that were somehow both joyful and relieved, as if she had been holding her breath for all those years waiting for him to honor his word. But that was still in the future on the day Michael Jordan was drafted by the Chicago Bulls and stepped into a new world where his every move would be scrutinized by millions of people who had expectations that seemed impossible to meet. The pressure of professional basketball was unlike anything he had experienced in college. The competition fiercer, the stakes higher, the margin for error almost non-existent. And there were nights during his rookie season when Michael called his mother from his apartment in Chicago and admitted that he was struggling, that he had never felt so alone, that he wondered if he had made a mistake. Dolores would stay on the phone with him for hours, reminding him of all the obstacles he had already overcome, telling him stories from his childhood that he had forgotten, reinforcing the belief that he was capable of meeting any challenge if he just kept working and remained true to himself. The transformation of Michael Jordan from talented rookie to global icon happened gradually and then suddenly, like a snowball rolling down a mountain, gathering mass and momentum until it became an unstoppable force. Dolores watched her son's ascent with a mixture of pride and concern, proud of his accomplishments but worried about the cost of his fame, the way it seemed to devour his privacy and turn him into public property. She noticed how his face would sometimes become a mask when he was in public, how he would switch into a performance of himself rather than being himself. And she mourned the loss of the unguarded boy who used to laugh freely without wondering who was watching. During one visit home, she had confronted him about it, asking if he was happy or if the success he had worked so hard to achieve was becoming a prison of its own design. And Michael had admitted that he sometimes felt like he was living in a fishbowl where everyone could see in but he could not see out, where the boundaries between his authentic self and his public persona had become so blurred that he sometimes lost track of where one ended and the other began. The championships came in a rush. 3 consecutive titles that cemented Michael's legacy as the greatest basketball player of his generation, and Dolores attended every game she could, sitting in premium seats that her son had arranged for her, but always feeling slightly uncomfortable with the luxury because she remembered when a ticket to a basketball game had been an extravagance the family could not afford. She preferred the days when Michael was just starting out and she could sit in the regular seats surrounded by ordinary fans who loved the game for its own sake rather than for the celebrity spectacle it had become. But she understood that success changed things, that doors opened and walls went up, and she tried to adapt to her new role as the mother of a superstar without losing sight of who she had been before any of this happened. James was less comfortable with the attention, preferring to stay in North Carolina, while Dolores traveled to watch Michael play. But he was no less proud of his son, and he would call after every game to get Dolores's detailed report of how Michael had performed and whether he had seemed happy. The tragedy that changed everything came suddenly and senselessly, the way terrible things often do, without warning or opportunity for preparation. James Jordan was driving home late one night when he pulled over to rest at a highway rest stop, and he never made it home because 2 young men decided to rob and kill him for reasons that made no sense to anyone who knew what a gentle and decent man he had been. The news reached Michael while he was on the road with the team, and he had collapsed when he heard, his legs simply giving out beneath him as if the foundation of his world had crumbled. Dolores received the news at home, and the scream that tore from her throat was so primal and anguished that neighbors came running to see what had happened, finding her on the floor clutching the phone and repeating the word no over and over, as if denial could reverse reality. The funeral was a blur of faces and flowers and empty condolences, and Michael stood beside his mother with tears streaming down his face while photographers captured his grief for front pages around the world, turning even his most private pain into public spectacle. In the months that followed, Dolores watched her son retreat into himself in ways that frightened her, his grief manifesting as a kind of cold fury that he channeled into basketball with such intensity that it seemed he was trying to punish himself or the world, or perhaps both. He led the Bulls to another championship that year, but there was no joy in his performance, only a grim determination that made people uncomfortable because it revealed the darkness that lived beneath his polished public image. When Michael announced his first retirement from basketball shortly after that championship, Dolores understood even if the rest of the world did not, recognizing that her son needed to step away from the game that had defined him because it had become entangled with memories of his father, because James had been his biggest fan, and playing without him in the stands felt like betraying his memory. She supported Michael's decision to pursue baseball, even though critics mocked him for it, because she understood that he was trying to honor his father's dream for him, that James had once imagined his son as a baseball player before basketball had claimed him. The baseball experiment lasted longer than anyone expected, but ultimately ended with Michael's return to basketball, and Dolores could see that something in her son had shifted during his time away, that he had processed his grief in whatever way he could and was ready to reclaim his place in the sport he had never truly left behind. The second three-peat of championships that followed seemed almost inevitable, as if Michael was determined to prove that his legend was not finished, and Dolores watched each victory with a bittersweet mixture of pride and sadness because James was not there to witness their son's continued greatness. She kept her grief private, not wanting to burden Michael with her own pain when he was carrying so much of his own. But there were nights when she would sit alone in the house she had shared with James and cry for all that had been lost, for the future they would never have together, for the grandchildren James would never get to spoil, for the simple pleasure of his company that she missed with an ache that never diminished. The years after Michael's final retirement brought a different kind of challenge, as he struggled to find purpose beyond basketball, and Dolores worried that her son was drifting without the structure that the game had provided. He threw himself into business ventures and ownership of the Charlotte Hornets, but she could see that nothing satisfied him the way basketball had, that he was searching for something that would fill the competitive void in his spirit. She tried to talk to him about it during their regular phone calls, suggesting that perhaps it was time for him to consider what legacy he wanted to leave beyond his athletic achievements. But Michael would deflect with humor or change the subject, unwilling or unable to confront the existential questions that haunted him. Dolores recognized the pattern because she had seen it in James during difficult times, this masculine reluctance to admit vulnerability, and she understood that pushing too hard would only make Michael retreat further. The secret that Dolores had been carrying began as a small thing, easy to hide and easier to ignore, just a lump that she noticed one day and told herself was nothing worth worrying about because she had always been healthy and strong. She did not mention it to Michael or to any of her other children because she did not want to cause them unnecessary concern, and she scheduled a doctor's appointment with the expectation that she would be told everything was fine and sent home with reassurance. Instead, the doctor had ordered tests, and the tests had revealed results that transformed her world from solid ground into quicksand. And suddenly, Dolores was the one who needed to be strong for her family, but was not sure she had the strength. The diagnosis was breast cancer, aggressive and advanced, and the oncologist had used words like metastasized and treatment options and survival rates that sounded like a foreign language, even though Dolores understood perfectly well what they meant. She had sat in that sterile office with its cheerful posters about fighting cancer and felt a rage so powerful that she wanted to overturn the desk and scream at the unfairness of it all. But instead, she had nodded calmly and asked what came next, because that was what she did. She moved forward no matter what obstacles appeared in her path. The decision to keep her diagnosis private for as long as possible was not made out of denial, but out of love, because Dolores knew that telling Michael would devastate him so soon after losing his father, would resurrect all the grief he had worked so hard to manage, and she wanted to spare him that pain for as long as she could. She began chemotherapy without telling anyone except her daughters, swearing them to secrecy and making them promise not to tell their brother. And she wore scarves and wigs to hide her hair loss, and forced herself to eat even when nausea made every bite a battle. The treatments left her exhausted and weak, but she scheduled them around Michael's visits so that he would not see her at her worst. and she became expert at deflecting his questions about her health with cheerful lies that burned her tongue even as she spoke them. Her daughters begged her to tell Michael the truth, arguing that he deserved to know, that he would want to be there for her. But Dolores remained adamant that the time was not right, that she would tell him when she was ready, that this was her decision to make. The months of treatment stretched into a year, and Dolores could feel her body weakening in ways that no amount of positive thinking could reverse, could feel the cancer spreading despite the poison they pumped into her veins in hopes of stopping it. She had always believed in the power of will to overcome any obstacle, had raised her children to believe that determination could achieve the impossible, but now she was learning the hard lesson that some battles cannot be won no matter how fiercely you fight them. The realization that she was dying came gradually and then all at once, like water seeping through a crack until the dam finally breaks, and she had to confront the fact that she would not be there to see her grandchildren grow up, would not grow old with the companionship of her children, would not have the years she had planned and dreamed about. The grief she felt was not for herself but for what her death would do to Michael, for the way it would compound the loss of his father and confirm his worst fear that the people he loved would always be taken from him too soon. The decision to do the television interview came from a place of desperation, a need to tell her story before it was too late, to speak the truth she had been hiding, and to prepare Michael in whatever small way she could for what was coming. The morning show host had reached out months earlier requesting an interview about what it was like to be Michael Jordan's mother, and Dolores had initially declined. But now she saw it as an opportunity to control the narrative of her illness, rather than letting it leak out through rumors and speculation. She did not tell Michael about the interview, knowing he would try to stop her or insist on being there, and she wanted to do this alone because it was her story to tell. The night before the taping, she had barely slept, rehearsing in her mind what she would say and how she would say it, determined to maintain her composure because she did not want pity, only understanding. The interview had started simply enough, with questions about Michael's childhood and her role in his development, and Dolores had answered with the stories she had told 100 times before, anecdotes that painted a picture of a close-knit family that had overcome adversity through love and determination. But then the host had asked about James, about how his death had affected the family, and Dolores had felt the first cracks in her carefully constructed composure because talking about James always brought her to the edge of tears. She had managed to speak about him without breaking down, describing his goodness and his love for his children and how much she missed him every single day. But then the host had asked what James would think of the man Michael had become, and that was when the dam finally burst. The tears came suddenly and unstoppably, and Dolores had tried to speak through them, tried to say that James would be so proud, but her voice kept breaking and the words would not come, and she had pressed her hands to her face and wept with a vulnerability she had not intended to show. What the audience did not know, what even the host did not know until that moment, was that Dolores's tears were not just for James but for herself, for the secret she was about to reveal. When she finally found her voice again, she had looked directly into the camera and said the words she had been holding inside for so long, announcing that she had stage 4 breast cancer, that the doctors had given her months at most, that she was dying. The host's face had registered shock, and the studio had fallen into stunned silence, but Dolores had continued speaking, her voice gaining strength as she told the truth she had been concealing. She talked about the fear and the pain and the devastating unfairness of facing death, just as life was supposed to be getting easier, about the nights she had spent wondering why this was happening to her when she had always tried to do the right thing, always tried to be a good mother and a good person. But most of all, she talked about Michael, about how she had not told him because she could not bear to add to his burden of grief, about how she was using this television interview as a way to tell him because she was too much of a coward to say the words to his face. The confession poured out of her in a torrent, words she had been holding back for so long that they tumbled over each other in their rush to be spoken. She told the camera, told Michael wherever he was watching, that she was sorry for keeping this secret, sorry for being selfish, sorry for not being strong enough to survive when he needed her to be there for him the way she had always been there. She said that the hardest part of dying was not the physical pain but the knowledge that she would be leaving her children, that she would miss so many moments she had looked forward to, that she would not be able to call Michael after his bad days and remind him that he was loved, that he was enough, that he did not have to be perfect to be worthy. The tears kept coming, and Dolores did not try to stop them anymore. did not care that millions of people were watching her fall apart, because in that moment, all that mattered was that she tell Michael everything she needed him to know before it was too late. She told him that she was proud of him, not because of his championships or his fame or his wealth, but because of the man he had become despite all the pressure and loss and disappointment, because he had remained fundamentally decent in a world that often rewarded cruelty. She told him that his father's death was not his fault, that there was nothing he could have done to prevent it, that James had died knowing he was loved by his son, and that was all any parent could ask for. She told him that her cancer was not his fault either, that it was just the random cruelty of biology, and that he should not waste time feeling guilty for not knowing because she had deliberately hidden it from him out of a misguided attempt to protect him. Most importantly, she told him that he needed to forgive himself for being human, for having limits, for not being able to save everyone or fix everything or live up to every impossible expectation that had been placed on him since he was a teenager. She said that it was okay to be sad, okay to be angry, okay to fall apart sometimes, because strength was not about never breaking, but about putting yourself back together after you shattered. The interview had ended with Dolores wiping her eyes and thanking the host for giving her the opportunity to speak her truth, and then she had walked off the set with her head held high, even though she felt like collapsing. She had turned off her phone after the taping because she knew it would immediately be flooded with calls and messages, and she had driven home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, wondering what Michael's reaction would be when he saw what she had just done. She did not have to wonder long because when she pulled into her driveway, Michael's car was already parked there, and he was sitting on her front steps with his head in his hands, and even from a distance she could see that his shoulders were shaking with sobs. Dolores had gotten out of her car slowly, her legs feeling unsteady, and Michael had looked up at the sound of her approach, and the expression on his face nearly destroyed her. He looked like the little boy who had been cut from his high school basketball team, lost and hurt, and desperate for someone to tell him everything would be okay. Except now, she could not give him that reassurance because everything was not going to be okay. Michael had stood up and taken 2 steps toward her and then stopped, as if he was afraid to get too close, afraid that if he touched her, she might disappear. They had stared at each other across the small distance that separated them, and Dolores had seen in her son's eyes all the questions he wanted to ask and all the accusations he wanted to make. But when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, asking why she had not told him, why she had made him find out on television like a stranger, why she had denied him the chance to be there for her, the way she had always been there for him. Dolores had no good answer to give him because the truth was complicated and messy and driven by instincts that made sense to her, but probably would not make sense to anyone else. She had walked toward Michael, and he had closed the remaining distance between them and wrapped his arms around her with such desperate intensity that she could barely breathe, and they had stood there in her driveway holding each other while neighbors pretended not to watch and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. Michael had whispered into her hair that he was sorry, so sorry, and she did not know what he was apologizing for, but she knew the feeling. That sense of somehow being responsible for things beyond your control. And she had stroked his back the way she used to when he was small and told him that none of this was his fault, that cancer was just cancer, and bad things sometimes happen to good people for no reason at all. They had gone inside and sat at the kitchen table where they had sat 1,000 times before, and Michael had held her hands across the scarred surface while she told him everything, all the details she had spared the television audience, the full extent of her diagnosis and prognosis, and the reality that she had maybe 3 months if she was lucky. Michael had listened without interrupting, his face going through every emotion from denial to anger to bargaining to grief. And when she finished speaking, he had asked what he could do, how he could help, what treatments she should try, because surely there was something, some doctor or facility or experimental therapy that could save her. Dolores had shaken her head and explained that she had already tried everything, had consulted with the best oncologist that money could buy, and they had all told her the same thing, that the cancer was too advanced and too aggressive, and that further treatment would only make her remaining time more miserable without extending her life in any meaningful way. The question Michael asked next came from a place of such raw vulnerability that it broke Dolores's heart to hear it, as he asked if she was giving up, if she was choosing to die rather than fight, because that was not the mother he knew, the mother who had taught him to never surrender no matter how bad things looked. Dolores had gripped his hands tighter, and told him that she was not giving up but rather accepting reality, that there was a difference between fighting with wisdom and fighting with futility, and that she wanted to spend her remaining time living rather than dying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that would only prolong her suffering. She said that she had made peace with her mortality, had said goodbye to the life she had hoped to live, and now she needed him to make peace with it too, because she could not die in peace if she thought he would spend the rest of his life consumed by grief and regret. Michael had pulled his hands away and stood up abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal, and Dolores could see him struggling to process everything she had told him, could see the part of him that wanted to reject this reality and impose his will upon it, the way he had always been able to impose his will on basketball courts. But there was no winning this game. No last-second shot that would reverse the outcome. No amount of skill or determination that would change the fact that Dolores was dying and nothing could stop it. The realization seemed to hit Michael all at once, and he had slumped against the counter and slid down to the floor and wept with the kind of unrestrained grief that he had not allowed himself since his father's death. Dolores had gotten up from her chair and sat beside him on the floor, cradling his head against her shoulder the way she had when he was young, and something had hurt him. And she had let him cry without trying to comfort him with empty platitudes, because sometimes grief just needed to be felt. They had sat there for a long time, mother and son on the kitchen floor, while the light faded from the windows and the house grew dark around them, and neither of them moved to turn on the lights because the darkness felt appropriate for the heaviness of the moment. Eventually, Michael's tears had subsided, and he had lifted his head and asked Dolores what happened now, what she wanted from him, how they should spend whatever time she had left. She had smiled at him through her own tears and said that she wanted him to live his life, to not put everything on hold to watch her die, because that would make her remaining time feel like a funeral instead of a celebration of the life she had lived. She wanted him to keep working, keep pursuing his passions, keep being the man she had raised him to be, and she wanted him to visit when he could, but not to feel guilty when he could not. Most of all, she wanted him to make her a promise, the same kind of promise she had extracted from him when he left college early, a promise that would outlive her and keep a part of her alive in his actions. Michael had nodded and said he would promise her anything, and Dolores had taken a deep breath and told him what she needed him to do. The promise she asked for was not simple or easy, and it required Michael to confront parts of himself that he had spent years trying to avoid. Dolores told him that she wanted him to open up, to let people in, to stop hiding behind the armor of his public persona and allow himself to be vulnerable and real. She said that she had watched him build walls around his heart after his father died, had seen him become increasingly isolated even as his fame connected him to millions of people, and she worried that he was going to spend the rest of his life alone because he was too afraid of being hurt again. She told him that love required risk, that meaningful relationships demanded vulnerability, that he could not protect himself from pain by refusing to let anyone matter to him. She wanted him to fall in love again, to remarry, to have more children, to build a family that would fill his life with purpose and joy, because she knew that without those connections he would just drift through his remaining years, accumulating accomplishments that meant nothing without someone to share them with. Michael had protested that it was too soon to talk about such things, that she was asking him to think about the future when all he wanted was to freeze time and keep her in the present. But Dolores had been insistent. She told him that she was not asking him to do these things tomorrow or next year or even in 5 years, but she needed him to promise that he would try, that he would not let grief turn him into a bitter shell of himself, that he would honor her memory by living fully rather than just surviving. She said that the greatest gift he could give her was the knowledge that her death would not break him permanently, that he would grieve and heal and eventually find joy again. Because that was what she had done after James died. Not because she loved him any less, but because staying alive meant continuing to live. Michael had finally nodded and made the promise, his voice hoarse from crying, and Dolores had pulled him close and thanked him and told him that he was the greatest achievement of her life, not because of his basketball career, but because of his capacity for love and his fundamental goodness. The weeks that followed were both precious and agonizing, as Dolores' health declined rapidly and Michael tried to balance his responsibilities with his need to be near his mother. He had arranged to work from North Carolina as much as possible, taking meetings remotely and delegating tasks that required his physical presence, and he spent his days at Dolores' house helping care for her as her body betrayed her bit by bit. He watched her struggle to eat, watched her wince with pain she tried to hide, watched her sleep for longer and longer periods as the cancer consumed her energy, and every day he felt a piece of his own heart dying with her. His siblings were there too, taking turns sitting vigil and sharing the burden of caregiving. But Michael felt a special responsibility as the oldest son, as if his success in other areas of life should somehow translate into an ability to save his mother, even though he knew that was irrational. One afternoon when Dolores was having a good day, more lucid and energetic than she had been in weeks, she had called Michael to her bedside and told him that she needed to say something while she still had the strength to say it. Michael had pulled a chair close and taken her hand, which had become so thin that he could feel every bone through the papery skin, and he had waited for her to speak. Dolores had looked at him with eyes that were still sharp despite the ravages of her illness, and she had told him that she needed to confess something, a secret she had carried since he was a child, something that had shaped her entire approach to raising him. Michael had felt a flutter of anxiety, wondering what revelation could possibly matter at this point, but he had nodded for her to continue. Dolores had explained that when Michael was very young, maybe 4 or 5 years old, she had taken him to a doctor because she was concerned about his behavior. The way he fixated on things with an intensity that seemed abnormal. The way he would practice the same physical movements over and over without apparent boredom. The way he seemed to process the world differently than other children. The doctor had suggested that Michael might be somewhere on the autism spectrum, a diagnosis that was less understood in those days and often came with dire predictions about a child's future potential. Dolores had been devastated by the suggestion, not because she thought there was anything wrong with her son, but because she feared how the world would treat him if he was labeled as different. She had rejected the doctor's recommendation for further testing and evaluation, deciding instead to channel Michael's intense focus and repetitive behaviors into basketball, where those same traits that might have been seen as deficits could become assets. She had never told anyone about this, not even James, and she had carried the secret for decades, wondering if she had done the right thing or if she had denied her son support he might have needed. She told Michael that she was not asking for forgiveness or validation, but she wanted him to know because she thought it might help him understand himself better. Might explain why he had always felt slightly out of step with the world around him, why relationships had always been difficult for him, why he had found it easier to communicate through basketball than through words. Michael had sat in stunned silence, trying to process what his mother had just told him, and his first emotion was not anger but a strange sense of relief, as if a puzzle he had been trying to solve his entire life had suddenly revealed its solution. He told Dolores that he was not upset with her for keeping this secret, that he understood why she had made the choices she made, and that he was grateful she had channeled his differences into something productive rather than trying to fix or suppress them. He said that basketball had indeed been his language, his way of making sense of a world that often confused him, and that without her wisdom in recognizing that, he never would have found his purpose. Dolores had cried with relief, having worried for so long that her son would resent her for withholding this information, and she had told him that his response was exactly why she loved him, because he had the capacity to understand complexity and to forgive imperfection. The conversation had continued for hours, Michael asking questions about his childhood that he had never thought to ask before, Dolores sharing memories and observations that cast familiar stories in new light. She told him about the time a teacher had suggested he be put in special education classes and how she had fought the school administration to keep him in regular classes. About the way he used to line up his toy cars in perfect rows and would become distraught if anyone disrupted the pattern. About how she had learned to communicate with him through action and demonstration rather than lengthy verbal explanations. Michael listened and laughed and cried as he discovered a new understanding of his own history, and he felt grateful that his mother was giving him this final gift of self-knowledge, this key to unlock parts of himself he had never fully understood. He told her that this revelation did not change anything about how he saw himself or his achievements, but it helped him be more compassionate toward his own struggles, to recognize that the things that made him great also made him different, and that being different was not a flaw but simply a variation of normal. As Dolores grew weaker and her lucid moments became rarer, Michael found himself having one-sided conversations with her while she slept, telling her about his day and his plans and his fears, talking to her the way he imagined people talk to God, hoping she could hear him even if she could not respond. He told her about the work he was doing with the Hornets and the challenges of ownership, about the charities he supported and the causes he believed in, about the ways he was trying to use his platform to make a positive difference, even though he knew he would never be able to live up to everyone's expectations. He told her that he was trying to honor the promise he had made to her, that he was making an effort to be more open with people and to let his guard down occasionally, even though it still felt unnatural and frightening to expose his true self. He told her that he missed his father every day, and soon he would miss her just as much, and he did not know how he was supposed to keep going with both his parents gone, but he would try because he had promised her he would try. The night Dolores died, Michael had been sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from one of the books she used to read to him as a child, a worn copy of a story about a boy who learned to fly. Her breathing had been labored and irregular, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a small surrender, and the hospice nurse had warned him that the end was very close. Michael had held his mother's hand and continued reading even though he knew she could not hear him anymore. Because stopping would have been an admission that she was leaving, and he was not ready for that admission. He read through tears that made the words blur on the page, his voice breaking repeatedly but never stopping, because as long as he kept reading there was still a connection between them, still a thread that tied mother to son. When her breathing finally ceased, Michael had finished the sentence he was reading before allowing himself to acknowledge what had happened. And then he had carefully closed the book and placed it on her chest and bent to kiss her forehead one last time. The funeral was a public event that Michael would have preferred to keep private, but he understood that his mother had touched many lives beyond their family and that people needed a way to pay their respects. Thousands of people attended, filling the church and spilling out into the streets, and Michael stood at the podium to deliver a eulogy that he had written and rewritten a dozen times without ever feeling like he had captured the totality of who his mother was. He spoke about her strength and her sacrifices, about the way she had believed in him when he had no reason to believe in himself, about the lessons she had taught him that had nothing to do with basketball and everything to do with being a decent human being. He told the crowd about the promise she had asked him to make and his intention to honor it, about her confession regarding his childhood and how it had given him new understanding of himself, about the fact that her death was devastating, but also a release from suffering, and that he was trying to find peace in knowing she was no longer in pain. What Michael did not share with the crowd was the private conversation he and his mother had during one of her last lucid moments, a conversation that was too personal and too raw to make public. She had beckoned him close and whispered that she was not afraid of dying, that she had lived a good life and had no regrets. But she was worried about him because she knew he would carry guilt about things that were not his fault. She made him promise one more time that he would not blame himself for not being able to save her, that he would not let her death send him back into the emotional isolation that had characterized the years after his father died, that he would remember the good times rather than fixating on the end. Michael had promised again, his forehead pressed against hers. And she had smiled and told him that he had always been her miracle, her proof that good things could come from hard work and faith and unwavering belief in potential. She said that being his mother was the greatest privilege of her life, and that even if she had known how it would end, she would not change a single thing about the journey they had shared. The weeks after the funeral were a blur of grief and obligation, as Michael tried to settle his mother's affairs while also processing his own loss. He found himself going through her house, touching objects that had belonged to her, trying to hold on to some physical connection to a woman who was now just memory. He found the coffee can where she used to save money for his first basketball, empty now, but still carrying the faint scent of coins and dreams. He found boxes of photographs documenting his entire life, carefully organized and labeled in her handwriting, a chronicle of a mother's love expressed through documentation. He found letters she had written but never sent, drafts of thoughts and feelings she had needed to express, even if they were never shared. And reading them felt like an invasion of privacy, but also like a gift. These glimpses into his mother's interior life. One letter in particular stopped Michael cold, a letter addressed to him but dated from years earlier, before her diagnosis, before his father's death, during a time when everything was still normal. In it, Dolores had written about her hopes for Michael's future, expressing her wish that he would find happiness beyond basketball, that he would learn to define himself by something other than his achievements, that he would discover the joy of being ordinary in a life that demanded he be extraordinary. She wrote that she worried about the pressure he was under, the way people expected him to be perfect, the way every mistake was magnified and every success was immediately forgotten in the demand for the next victory. She told him that she loved him not for what he did, but for who he was, and that her greatest fear was that he would forget there was a difference between those two things. Reading those words, Michael felt his mother's presence so strongly, it was as if she was in the room with him, and he made a silent promise to try to remember that distinction, to try to separate his worth as a person from his accomplishments as an athlete and businessman. The response that Michael gave to his mother's breakdown on television, the response that had melted millions of hearts, came not in words but in action, in the way he lived his life in the years that followed her death. He had understood that the best way to honor Dolores was not through grand gestures or public declarations, but through the daily choice to be the person she had raised him to be. He became more generous with his time and resources, establishing scholarships and programs in his mother's name that helped young people overcome the kind of obstacles she had faced. He became more open in his personal relationships, allowing himself to be vulnerable with friends and family in ways he never had before, admitting when he was struggling rather than pretending to have everything under control. He remarried and became a father again, opening his heart to the possibility of love despite the risk of loss, because his mother had taught him that the alternative to risking pain was guaranteeing emptiness. Most significantly, Michael began speaking publicly about mental health and emotional well-being, sharing his own struggles with grief and depression in the hopes that his honesty might help others feel less alone. He talked about how his mother's death had sent him into a dark place where he had questioned everything about his life and his choices, how he had sought therapy to work through his complicated feelings about success and identity and loss, how he had learned that strength sometimes meant admitting weakness, and that vulnerability was not the opposite of toughness but rather its complement. People were shocked by this new openness from someone who had always been so guarded, but Michael explained that he was keeping a promise to his mother, that she had asked him to let people in and he was doing his best to honor that request, even though it still made him uncomfortable. The true answer to why Dolores had broken down on television, the secret that was revealed only to those closest to Michael, was not just about her own mortality, but about her fear that her son would waste his life in pursuit of an impossible perfection that would never satisfy him. She had cried because she loved him so completely, and because she knew that her death would devastate him in ways he might never recover from, and she had used that public forum to try to reach him one last time with a message he needed to hear. The message was that life was too short to spend it trying to be perfect, that the love of family and friends mattered more than any championship or business deal, that being human meant accepting limitation and imperfection, and still finding joy in the midst of struggle. She had broken down because she was trying to break through, to penetrate the armor her son had built around his heart, to remind him that beneath the legend was a man who deserved to be loved for himself rather than for what he could do. Michael's response to that message, the response that melted hearts around the world, was simply to live differently, to make choices that prioritized connection over achievement, to build a life that his mother would be proud of not because it was extraordinary but because it was authentic. He learned to say no to opportunities that would have taken him away from his family, to prioritize presence over productivity, to measure success by the depth of his relationships rather than the size of his bank account. He learned to laugh more easily and cry more freely, to admit when he was wrong and ask for help when he needed it, to be imperfect in public and accept that people would love him anyway, or perhaps even more because of his flaws. He became more patient and more compassionate, both toward others and toward himself, recognizing that everyone was fighting battles that were invisible from the outside. On the anniversary of his mother's death, Michael established a tradition of gathering his family together to share stories about Dolores, ensuring that his children who had never known her would still feel connected to her legacy. He would tell them about her strength and her wisdom, about the way she had transformed poverty into opportunity and limitation into possibility, about how she had believed in him when no one else did and had loved him when he felt unlovable. He would tell them about the promise he had made to her and how he tried every day to keep it, about how their grandmother had taught him that the greatest victory was not winning a championship, but winning the daily battle to be kind and present and authentic. The children would listen with wide eyes, and Michael would see Dolores in their faces, in the way his daughter tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something, in the way his son practiced basketball moves with an intensity that reminded him of his own childhood obsession. Years after Dolores's death, a reporter asked Michael what he missed most about his mother, and he had paused for a long time before answering. He said that he missed her wisdom and her laughter, her ability to put things in perspective and remind him what actually mattered, but most of all, he missed the way she looked at him, as if he was both completely ordinary and absolutely miraculous at the same time. He said that his mother had possessed the rare gift of seeing him fully, both his greatness and his flaws, and loving him not, despite the contradiction but because of it. He said that losing her had forced him to become the person who could see himself with that same kind of generous clarity, to serve as his own source of unconditional love and acceptance, and that learning to do that had been the hardest and most important work of his life. The story of Dolores Jordan breaking down on television and Michael's response became legendary, not because it was dramatic or surprising, but because it was profoundly human. A reminder that even the greatest athletes and most successful people are still subject to the universal experiences of love and loss and grief. People responded to the story because it showed that strength is not about never falling apart, but about having the courage to fall apart in front of others and the resilience to put yourself back together. They responded because it demonstrated that the most meaningful legacy a parent can leave is not wealth or fame, but wisdom and love. Lessons that outlive the teacher and continue to guide the student through every challenge and triumph that follows. They responded because in watching Michael honor his mother's final wishes by living more openly and authentically, they were reminded of their own parents and the ways they had been shaped by maternal love and sacrifice. In the end, what melted millions of hearts was not any single dramatic moment, but rather the accumulation of small choices Michael made every day to live differently, to be better, to honor the woman who had given him everything. It was the way he showed up for his children's school events even when it was inconvenient, the way he supported his siblings through their own struggles even when he was dealing with his own, the way he used his platform to advocate for causes his mother cared about, the way he allowed himself to age and soften and become more human, rather than clinging to the mythical perfection of his youth. People saw in his transformation a model for their own lives, a permission to be imperfect and still worthy, to grieve deeply and still find joy, to honor the dead by living fully, rather than being paralyzed by loss. The greatest tribute to Dolores Jordan was not the buildings named after her or the scholarships established in her memory, but rather the way her son carried her teachings forward into the world, spreading her wisdom to millions of people who would never know her name but would benefit from the lessons she had taught him about love and resilience and the courage to be vulnerable. Michael's story reminds us that real strength comes from opening our hearts, even when it hurts. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from right now. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so we can spread more kindness together. There's another amazing story waiting for you on the screen right now, so click it and let's keep this journey going.